All right, sorry about that. I'll try and edit out that later. This is part of the awkwardness of having to teach into a camera rather than people, but we'll work with it. If I we'll work with it. Okay. So what I was getting at before is that we can also take a definition of universal as not being what people actually do believe, but what they, and this is a word it's a controversial word, but we'll see that it's really hard to actually avoid, what they should believe because it's actually true. You see, that's the thing about, for example, just to use the shape of the world again, is it's either the case that it's flat or it's the case that it's round, right? Something can't be both flat and round at the same time in the same way by the logical law of non-contradiction. So in seeking to answer that question, maybe the best way to figure something out isn't to actually do a survey and find out what people do believe, but actually what they should believe because it's true. Well, now this is also important from a moral perspective as well. So for example, if you did a survey of a global population, say, I don't know, 300 years ago, and you asked them about the moral status of slavery, you'd probably have a very high response rate on the side of saying that slavery is morally acceptable, especially depending on where you were asking that question. And you'd probably find a very small amount of people who say that no, slavery is not morally acceptable. Well, if we just use the majority view of that view, then by definition, slavery would have to be considered morally acceptable if a majority of people believe that to be true. But you see, that doesn't work, right? Because a majority of people could potentially believe anything to be true. And what we want to know, not only in terms of the structure of reality, talking about the shape of our globe, but also in terms of our morality as well and as our values, is not what a bunch of people actually believe. We want to know whether or not what they believe is true or not true. So that gets at another definition of universal, not what's empirically the case, meaning what people actually believe, but what they should believe because it's true. Now, true, of course, is a complex word. It's a complex concept, and we'll be dealing with it throughout the entire semester. But basically, it comes down to this. Can we avoid using that word? Because I could say, for example, well, I don't think it's true that there is truth. Well, what do we run into right away, right? Well, you think it's not true that there's truth, but you think that's true, right? This is the fundamental problem of seeming to avoid any kind of what's called a truth claim, is that anytime we seek to avoid it by saying, well, it's impossible to determine what the truth is, you think it's true that it's impossible to determine what the truth is. So hold on to that just a second, because that's going to be important. So let's use this second definition here. Let's say, do you believe at least one of your values is universal? And by universal, you mean true. You mean true. You mean it's actually true. And independent of what people do believe or don't believe, you believe that it's the case. And again, it's complex on how to define that, but we'll hold it on in just most basic sense. You think it's actually true. Okay, well, let's say you take the yes position. For the sake of argument, you say, yes, at least one of my values I think is universally true. Okay, that's a potentially reasonable position to take, but what's the complexity? The complexity is whatever value you've identified, you'd have to explain, especially in light of the empirical fact that it's not universally shared, meaning not everybody actually says that, especially in the same way once we get down to the nitty-gritty details. You'd have to explain, well, how is it possible that something that I think is universally true, meaning it's universal in the sense that everybody should believe it, well, how do I explain that people don't believe it? And how do I explain cultures where values that I take for granted is like the most morally obvious thing, like you shouldn't sacrifice somebody, you shouldn't cut out somebody's heart on the top of an altar and use them as an unwilling sacrifice, or even a willing sacrifice. Like, I think that's morally obvious. Well, then how do I account for the existence of cultures where, at least within components of that culture, it wasn't morally obvious? And of course, the question multiplies itself with whatever potential value you point to that we think is morally obvious. So I'm not saying it's impossible to do that. I'm not saying it's impossible to give an account of how a moral value can be true even when it's not practiced universally, but that's a serious question. You'd also have to be able to answer a question, which we'll get into later, which is called the epistemological question. The epistemological question is, how do I know? And how does everybody know that this moral value is true? And we add that to the previous issue. Well, if everybody can know something is true, then how did these people in this time and space not know it? Or did they know it and didn't care? It gets complicated, right? So for the sake of argument, yes is a pretty complex position to take. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm saying it's complex. So let's say, sort of intimidated by all the work you'd have to do to be on the yes side, you then move to the no side, and you say, I recognize what you're saying, and maybe I can't come up with a good explanation for that. So I guess I just have to say, no, none of my values are true. Whatever they are, none of them are true. I hold them. I think they're true for me, I guess, but not like actually true, because that would mean that I would be on the yes side and I can't justify yes side. So I'm going to say no. Okay, maybe that sounds better. Maybe that sounds like a more reasonable position to take. But here's the problem with the no side. If you don't believe something is true, like really true, then why in the world would you believe it? I mean, seriously, like you could say, for example, I believe wearing, eating meat is wrong. And someone says, oh, why do you think eating meat is wrong? You say, well, I believe it to be true. It's wrong. And you say, oh, you believe, so you believe it's a universal value? No, I don't think it's universal value. I just think it's wrong. And then someone says, but why do you think it's wrong? And you end up saying something like, well, I don't think it's true, but I think it's wrong. So then someone says to you, so you think something that's neither true nor false for you is wrong, and you can't explain to yourself why you think it's wrong. You just say that it's wrong, even though you admit that you don't actually believe it's violating any standard of truth. You're just saying it. You say, yeah, that's about it. Well, there's some implications there. One, of course, is the implication of how moral debate is possible. Think about that. Like if you want to engage with a debate with somebody about whatever particular moral issue or political issue or whatever it may be the case, and you have two different positions, and someone comes up and says, this is my position, and the other person says, well, I disagree with you, and I think you have the wrong position. And you say back to them, and you're on the no side, you say, well, I think you're wrong. And then the person B will say, well, tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me why your position is true. And you say to them, oh, I don't think my position is true. I just think it's mine. And so the other person says, well, convince me. And you say to them, I can give you no reason apart from the reason that I say it, like it comes out of my mouth, why you should adopt my position. Well, that's not going to convince anybody, right? Basically what that comes down to is, take my position because I say it. It comes down to the worst form of authoritarianism. The other problem, of course, is you can't even explain to yourself. If you don't believe your value is true, you can't even explain to yourself why you believe it, right? If I say, I think eating meat is true, and then I say to myself, but why do I believe that? Say, well, I just feel it to be the case. But well, then how do you know that that feeling is actually accurately grabbing onto something that's real, right? If you can't articulate why that feeling is pointed to something that's true, well, then how do you know that that feeling is a true feeling? It's not a false feeling. Ever had a false feeling before? Ever felt something that's not actually correspond with reality? Whatever the case may be, well, then how do you determine whether which feelings you're having are true and which feelings you're having are false, understood as corresponding to the way things that they're not corresponding to an illusion, for example, or something you think to be the case that's not actually the case. Like, for example, with our own children, sometimes, there's a specific kind of pattern of usually who's getting into trouble, doing what kind of thing. And I can hear a sound and think, oh, there she goes again. There's our little daughter, Julieta, doing whatever she does. It's driving me crazy. And I come out there and I'm angry. I'm already angry at Julieta for doing something that I know she's done. And so it's a real feeling, right? But then I discover, oh, it wasn't her this time. It was one of the other kids, even though they're older. Well, then how did I know that my feeling, which was real, actually corresponds to a real situation? Well, I had to investigate. But in order for me to determine the truth of the matter, I had to say that there is a truth to investigate. But here you're saying, well, no, there's no actual truth. There's just your feelings, are just your assertions, which means, again, you can't tell yourself why you believe what you believe. And so over here you have, right? How do you get universality is the question, with the big question mark. How do you justify it epistemologically and account for the fact that not everybody does what you think they should be doing? Here you have the problem of what's called arbitrariness. Arbitrariness, meaning, literally speaking, there's no reason you can give yourself or anyone else why you believe what you believe. So now we are in some trouble here, right? Why? Because on the one hand, it's hard for us to explain how a value could be true universally if we're on the yes side, if we can't account for those things that I said. On the other hand, if we want to take the no side, then we say, well, can I believe anything at all? Like literally, can I have any moral belief at all that's coherent, even within my own thinking? So a real problem here. Well, maybe then the solution is to say, well, you know, I'm going to say maybe. I'm going to compromise, right? We've all been taught you should compromise. It's always good to compromise. Okay, sounds good. Compromise always sounds reasonable, doesn't it? So maybe one of my values is universally true, or maybe it's not. I'm not going to take a position there. I'm just going to recognize that there's some ambiguity. I'm going to embrace the ambiguity and say, could be, maybe not. Okay, well, let me tell you something then. I'm going to make some statements, and I want you to tell me if they're true statements or false statements. Statement number one. I am a married bachelor. I'll tell my wife, but I'm a married bachelor. Am I saying something that's true, or am I saying something that's false? What do you think? Well, that's like, it's a nonsensical statement, right? Assuming that there's fixed conceptual content to what married means and fixed conceptual content to what bachelor means, it's literally nonsensical. It's like saying you're a 0 and a 1. It's literally nonsensical to say that you are a married bachelor. It's not something you can even assess because it's nonsense. You can't determine whether it's true or false in terms of actually having substantive true content. It makes your brain go, right? You can't even grab onto it. Well, how about if I say this? I have a beautiful vase, that's a fancy way of saying it, a vase of colorless yellow roses. Am I lying to you or am I not lying to you? A vase of colorless yellow roses. Well, so we run into the same problem, right? We run into the exact same problem. And the problem is this, it's nonsense. Either these roses are colored by definition or they're not colored by definition. And so you can't really say, well, maybe he's telling the truth, maybe he's not. You have to say that the statement itself just doesn't make sense. So how about if I write this statement here, and I'll write it on this board over here. Write it nice and big. My values are sometimes, I got off camera, sorry. My values are sometimes always true. My values are sometimes always true. Does that make sense? Is that a commonsensical thing to say? Well, no, right? And why not? Because we run into the exact same problem. Something is either sometimes by definition or something is always by definition. Our minds don't allow us to conceive of a middle ground between something either being sometimes or always. We can't compromise between two absolute concepts. Well, isn't that the problem we run in here, right? To say maybe my belief is true, meaning universal, and universal meaning true, maybe. Aren't I saying that sometimes it could be the case that it's universal, and sometimes it could be the case that it's not sometimes. In other words, I'm saying sometimes always my belief is true. That's what I'm saying. Maybe means sometimes always my belief is universal, understood as true. Well, it's nonsensical, right? It doesn't cut doesn't meet the most basic level of logical coherence to say that. Okay, well, maybe there's one more option to say, okay, I see it does appear to be contradictory, but you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say I'm a skeptic. Let's just say I don't know how to answer this question because
My position is skepticism. What I wait for is I wait to see what sort of the answer emerge over time, and until then I withhold judgment because I understand things are complex. So I'm skeptical about the question. All right, so you're skeptical. We're skeptical. It's good to be skeptical sometimes, right? Because we want to really determine the truth. But what does it mean to say I'm a skeptic? Now, skepticism has a long and complex philosophical history, but there's the question of whether or not skepticism itself as a concept makes sense if you define absolute skepticism. Because to be skeptical in an absolute sense, you have to be skeptical of your skepticism, right? If you're really truly skeptical. But then you have to be skeptical of your skepticism of your skepticism. And if you're really truly a skeptic, then you have to be skeptical of your skepticism of your skepticism of your skepticism. And built within all this skepticism, you have to say, I'm skeptical about whether or not skepticism actually really has any content. And I'm skeptical whether or not really I am an I, who could potentially answer this question. And I'm skeptical about whether or not a question is even possible to be formulated. And then I'm skeptical about the grammatical formulations that make any of this possible, that would be able to even to make this as a possible query that could be answered. Skeptical, right? You have to pull everything apart. And your mind at that point can't even grab onto anything because everything's been sort of pixelated and turned into dust. Right? So to say you're a skeptic, at the very least, and there's such thing as mitigated skepticism, which is different, but say yourself, you're an absolute skeptic, at the very least, you must say, I believe it's true that what? I'm a skeptic. You have to believe that's true about yourself, and then you have to say that, well, I think that's the true position, is skepticism is the right position. In other words, it looks like, for the sake of argument, that there's really no middle ground on this question. So either it's the case that we believe that there's a universal value, or it's the case that we don't believe there's a universal value, and it's back to that 0-1 that I started the video off with. But it gets even a little more complex, then we'll wrap things up. How's a little more complex? Let's say, for example, I am a very famous cultural anthropologist. And I've done a study where I've spent 20 years of my life working out in the field and interviewing thousands and thousands of different communities looking for that one universal value. And I come back and I give this huge lecture that's been widely anticipated because I'm famous. And I make my conclusion to my audience. And my conclusion is there's no such thing as universal values in this world, ladies and gentlemen. There just doesn't exist. And I have here the empirical proof to demonstrate it. Okay, so let's say you're out in the audience and you've listened to this, and there's a lot of amazing stories, a lot of amazing data, things you never imagine that people do in the world, but appears to be normal for them in that particular part of the world. But you say, no, I'm not convinced. So you get up, question time, you get up to the microphone, you say, thank you, Professor Petrusik, for your really compelling presentation. However, I disagree. I think that there are still universal values. And me, as a polite professor, I listen, or pretend to be listening, nodding my head, and I say, well, thank you for your question. And then I say what to you? I say, I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong to believe that there are such things as universal values. Well, on the surface, that sounds like just a back and forth, right? I think you're wrong. You think I'm wrong. And so we're just having a debate. But here, again, what we're looking at here is an absolute form of relativism, where we're saying there's no such thing as any truth, especially moral truth. Well, here's the thing about that, though, right? Excuse me. I believe that I'm right about you being wrong, right? And I believe that I'm right, not because I'm just saying it as this hypothetical cultural anthropologist. I believe I'm right because I think I'm telling you the truth. In other words, even people who are on this side who say, no, there's no such thing as the truth, morally or otherwise, believe what? They believe that is true. They believe it's true that there is no truth. And they think that truth is actually the case. Universally the case. Through all time and all space, there never has been truth. There never will be truth. There just is no truth. It's false to believe there's truth. It's true to believe that there's no truth, right? In other words, for the sake of argument, it appears that there's no such thing as a true cultural or subjectivist. understood in absolute terms. Why? Because even if you're on this side, you still believe that your position is the right position, that it's a true position, which means that all of us, in one way or another, end up being universalists of one sort or another. Now, why does this matter for the rest of the course? I'll be asking very frequently, do you believe this? Do you believe that? And a lot of it, as you get in your papers especially, right, you're going to have to be coming up with your own positions and defending them. Keep in mind as you're answering those questions, two things. One, ask yourself really whether it is possible to avoid universalism, whether it really is possible to avoid the question of truth. See if it's really true that you can't speak about the truth, that the truth can actually be discarded with your own positions, right? Or whether you ultimately find yourself, for all the reasons we've talked about, back on the side of saying, well, I think this is true. Not empirically true necessarily, but true. So that's question number one. Question number two is recognizing that there must be a truth, right? So it's either true that there is a truth or it's true there's not a truth. Tells us nothing about what that truth is. Like zero. It just says that there is a truth. So the next step in our analysis would have to be how, both methodological, how are we going to determine there's a truth? Like what's the techniques we're going to use? What's the resources we have at our disposal? And then two, what kinds of potential truths can we come to with regards to our moral values and our political values, etc. So on the one hand, this does a lot of work. This thought experiment does a lot of work. But another way, it just sort of sets the table for what we want to do with the rest of the semester. All right. So I know this may be a lot. Spend some time watching the video as many times as you want. Let me know if you have any questions. But keep this alive. Keep this alive as we move forward with all the other course material. All right. Thanks all for watching, and I'll see you again soon. And now you get to watch me move forward awkwardly and click the button to turn this off.